Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City Schools. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. Over the last couple of years, the community organization called Facing Race, Embracing Equity Coalition, or the acronym FREE, has been meeting in working groups dedicated to 5 areas. They are housing, health disparities, jobs and economic opportunities, juvenile and criminal justice, and education. Today we're pleased to have 3 members of FREE's Race and Education Working Group, Group Coordinator Reverend Judy Davis, and group members Pat Mannix and Howard Eagle. Welcome to Spotlight on Schools.
Thank you for inviting us.
Okay, can you each tell us a bit of your backgrounds that bring you to this group? Judy, we'll start with you.
Well, what actually brings me to this group is an experience I had as probably as a youth, as 8 years old. I still remember one day just walking towards the bedroom and seeing my father sitting on the corner of the bed and just overcome with despair and his head in his hands. And even though I didn't understand everything as an 8-year-old, I always asked myself, what is it that happens to you out there that you look like that in here? And so my academic journey, even in elementary, high school, whenever there was an opportunity to write some kind of paper, I was always looking to write something about how does racism impact psychologically African Americans. Now, as an adult and coming into my call as a minister and a person who ministers to souls and to spirits, I need to understand the dark, cramped place that the spirit and the soul go into as a result of racism. And not only the soul of African Americans or people of color, but also the soul of whites of European descent.
Okay, Pat, let's move to you.
Well, I was a community organizer for a great many years, and several years ago I had an opportunity to take a 3-month course with a group called Moving Beyond Racism, and it was life-changing for me. I had grown up in a white suburb of Rochester, had attended mostly white schools, had white friends. Even when I worked, most of my colleagues were white. And so race was not something that was forefront in my mind. But after I took this 3-month course, it just changed everything. And I became absolutely, I guess you would almost say, fanatical at learning all I could about racism, about the history of it, about the effect of it, the present day things that are still going on because of it, and began to see it as the root of indeed all of our problems. And so I became a racism educator and doing workshops and talks and running book groups and whatever to advance the knowledge about white privilege and racism. And that's how I ended up with FREE. And I truly believe that if anything's going to change, the education platform is where it has to change.
Okay, well, thank you. And Howard?
Yes, sir. I've been involved in the Black liberation struggle for 35 years consecutively, and that is, the struggle to bring about fairness, justice, equality for African American people, but for all of humanity ultimately. But my work has focused on the community that I come from, that is the Black community. And in the process of doing that work, most of my activity has centered around education and criminal justice. And so when we work in those systems, work really to change those systems, racism is something that we naturally have to confront, just as it is in every major institution in this society, because racism is embedded in the fabric of all the major institutions of the society. You might recall that some years ago, around 2007, 8, something like that, myself and a few other grassroots community activists developed an organization called Activists Against Racism Movement. And we did some things in this city that had never been done before. For example, we brought together another one of those institutions that has racism embedded in its foundation, that is mass media. We brought together all of the major mass media in town, all of the television stations, the newspapers, the radio, to examine their role in the continued perpetuation of individual and institutionalized racism. And we had hope for ongoing discussions. Those discussions went on for a couple of months, and then people began to back away from the table one at a time because apparently they didn't understand the nature and how hard the work would be in terms of really producing change. So FREE is the vehicle that I'm associated with now, doing the same work that I've been doing 35 years.
And if I could add on to what I shared before, what makes FREE unique for me is that they want to address structural racism, and that's what I want to look at. So often we look at addressing the impact of racism, looking at poverty, looking to provide meals, looking to provide financial assistance, looking to provide individual development through mentoring programs and education, et cetera. But I wanted to look at how do structures, how do institutions, their policies and their practices, when they come together, impinge upon every facet of an African American or a Latino's life. And so that's what's unique about FREE, is that we're looking to address structural racism.
Okay. Howard, I think it's also worth saying that for many years you were a teacher in the Rochester City School District. Social studies, I believe, middle school?
Yes, sir. Social studies for 23 years at the high school level, 7 through 12, social studies for 23 years. And even in that role, you probably remember, I constantly raised the racism that's in fact built into the system in various ways through the curricula, through who we hire, who we fire, who we retain, and in many other ways. So yeah, even in that capacity as a teacher, I continued to raise the issue, which you probably remember made me pretty unpopular in many circles.
Well, your name showed up in the paper a lot of times.
Yes, sir.
I read it all the time. Okay, well, let's move on. The next question I had was, what is the history and the thinking behind the Facing Race and Embracing Equity Coalition? We talked before this, and we decided that, Pat, you were going to handle that question.
Well, it goes back a few years. Someone at the U of R heard about the race exhibit that was touring the country and thought it would be a great idea if we were to have that come to the Museum and Science Center. And so contact was made with Kate Bennett, who is the director at the museum, and they knew that they were going to have to find funding for this, and so they contacted James Norman at ABC. Now, ABC had been working on racial initiatives for a few years. They had brought a gentleman named John Powell to Rochester, and they had a group called RISE, which was the Rochester Initiative for Social Equity. And so they were interested in this. So the three units, the U of R, the museum, and ABC, approached the Rochester Area Community Foundation to try and get the funding. And in the meantime, the Rochester Area Community Foundation had a fact-finding group that was called Act Rochester, which was compiling devastating statistics about how it really was here in Smugtown, and that it wasn't quite the thing to be smug about that we had always thought it was. And so when they laid out these statistics on a racial basis, they were absolutely appalling. So the time was right. They began to talk about what kind of initiatives could they have before the exhibit got here to wake up people to the need to see the exhibit, and then during the exhibit, what kind of things could go on, and after the exhibit, how could they continue this to take the whole county of Monroe and wake it up to the needs that had to be initiated to stamp out racism in our community. And so that was the birthing of the FREE initiative. So those were the four major players at that time: the U of R, the museum, the ABC, and the Rochester Area Community Foundation. And so they worked together, and pretty soon they had a launch, which took place at the Asbury Church. And they had planned to have one day with this big meeting where they would tell everybody about the initiative. And it was so oversubscribed that they had to do two. And they had over 400 people that came, and these were people in leadership positions in many of the nonprofits and in some of the other places around the town. This was how the Democrat and Chronicle got involved with their Unite Rochester campaign, because they came to one of those launches and said, wow, we better get in on this. But they were not a founding member of this by any means, and their initiative to give publicity to race is kind of, aside. It's a cooperative thing, but it isn't connected with free. And in the meantime, also, the YWCA had started up an initiative called Stand Against Racism, and they were having that every they have had it for like 4 years now, the last Friday in April. And they began out of, the first one was at the Central Library, and Jean Carroll, the director at the YWCA, told her own personal story, which was very moving. And so the woman who was the head of the Friends of the Public Library, Linda Rock, decided that there should be more. This shouldn't just die. And so she assembled different people representing different groups and initiated conversations about race, which started going out into libraries around town and having these little conversations, which were pretty well attended. Mostly, they were very well attended. And people were eager to talk about this, which was kind of a surprise because it had never been a popular subject. And so, so that was the time was right in Rochester. It really was, and pretty soon it became the in thing to talk about.
But talking about it created a problem. I know, Judy, you and I, and all of us had a conversation about it wasn't easy for everyone to talk about, particularly white folks. There's a quote that was in an article, and I'm going to quote it. I'm going to repeat it back to you and get your take on it. Here's the quote. It appeared in the May 22nd article in the Democrat and Chronicle. Here's what you said. Racism operating in the room became a growing problem. Now, in the room, that is the room of the Racism in Education Working Group. White privilege, and the word privilege was supplied for you in the quote in parentheses. White privilege showed up as a fear of conflict, where safe meant emphasizing politeness and equating the raising of difficult issues with being impolite. It's easier, and for some more comfortable, to skirt the issue than to face it squarely. Free faces the issue. Is that an accurate quote?
I guess it's pretty close. What I was lifting up is I started with the Race and Education Work Group. I wasn't one of the facilitators. I started as a member. And as a person sitting in the work group as a member and coming from week to week, whenever African Americans in the room would try to uplift examples of racism, attitudes and behaviors, that there would be silence and uncomfortability. There'd be a tension in the room because the fear, I believe, was no one in the room wanted to be called racist. And so the facilitators sometimes would protect persons from, if a person in the room said something in particular, an African American challenged them on what they said and their thinking process behind it, the facilitators would protect that person and try to change the conversation or try to distract the conversation to something else or dispel what the African American was saying. And so that would happen over and over again in the room. And one classic example that I watched as a member of the work group.
I'll tell you what, we're at 14 minutes. We're going to come back and hear that example. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Spotlight on Schools. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. Today we have three members of the educational group of the Facing Race, Embracing Equity Coalition. We've been talking about when you first organized your working group, you had a few problems. You had a story to tell us about that.
Yes. In our particular group, there's the assumption that when we have a discussion that we're going to follow a Eurocentric communication style. In a Eurocentric communication style, when the person is speaking, they speak monotone and devoid of emotion and quiet.
Pardon me? Okay, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Whereas a person of African descent, the communication style is animated, louder. When racism is operating in the room, since it's been said by society, the acceptable communication style when we're having a discussion is to be quiet and monotone and devoid of emotion. When a person is speaking in an animated fashion, especially a dark-skinned African American, the tension in the room rose up very much so that you could feel the fear in the room that maybe this person's about to hit people. Because again, it's not matching the acceptable communication style that was set, the tone set in the room. The gentleman who was speaking at the time noticed and realized that the tension had arisen in the room. And instead of speaking in an animated, not emotional, but passionate fashion, the person began to speak in a monotone, devoid of emotion tone. The tension in the room went way down, and people were at peace and comfortable again. That's an example of racism in the room that I'm lifting up. That when an African communication style sought to express itself in the room, it was not accepted, it was not considered a valid way of speaking, and people became very uncomfortable and even fearful that violence is about to take place. So that is an example of something that was happening and operating in the room that eventually I spoke on and a few others in the room began to speak on. There's another thing operating in the room where persons wanted to have this word that you use, ouch. So if someone says something that offends them in the room, they can say ouch. And then we're supposed to stop the conversation to find out why they were saying ouch. At this time, new persons were joining the work group, and African Americans were joining the work group. And that's when I had moved into the role of facilitator, seeking to still use the guidelines that the previous facilitators had. And just to see the faces of the African Americans when I introduced this word of using ouch, that's just so antithetical to an African communication style. If you ask me a question, I'll just answer it. I don't need to set a preference. I don't need to set a safe space before I speak. But that was something that was necessary for the white persons in the room. And so again, using these communication styles that are foreign to the African American style, identifying the African American style as not valid, is not the way to go in communication, was really, I think, the beginning of the problems in the room, especially when we decide to highlight it and begin to point it out to whites in the room, and they became very upset.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that you got the connection, because we talked about two different things. We talked about how things were initially under what I think some of us believe was inappropriate leadership from the start. You had people who didn't really have the knowledge, the understanding for how to deal with this or even recognize what Reverend Davis just described. And even when they did, they recognized, of course, the tension, but the response would be to almost chastise the black person. You've got to calm down and so forth, to take the voice away. So in terms of the quote that you asked about originally, Free faces that. We do now, the education group does, and part of that is because the people who are leading the education group understand the dynamics that she's explaining and so forth, right? Reverend Davis and Dr. Wood. And so it's a process that we have gone through, so that now it's absolutely accurate that in the education work group, Free faces racism, and we call it out. And we believe we have to do that if we're really serious about doing this work effectively.
And really, to be honest, it is such a problem when you're trying to have a conversation on race. What I just talked about, beginning to say that the African American or Latino, whoever's speaking, that their style of communication is just as valid. I do not have to assimilate to your style to be heard, but that's what was expected. It became so much of a problem that actually I was asked to be a part of a workshop where I was asked to do a workshop on speaking in a safe, what does it mean to have a safe environment in which to speak? And I used an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond. In the episode, the father was in the grocery store and the sign said no sampling. So he started to eat the peanuts, eat the jujubes, he was eating everything in the store. And so the grocer said, "Excuse me, sir, the sign says no sampling." He said, "I just had a few, it doesn't mean anything. I'm just saying, sir, the sign says no sampling, so you're eating stuff you haven't paid for, you're stealing." Well, to call that stealing, Frank got totally enraged in a moment because he was having cognitive dissonance. My sampling can't be called stealing because I'm a good person. I don't steal. So I can't allow you to call my sampling stealing. And the whole entire show, for 30 minutes, the whole show was talking about whether his sampling was stealing or not. By the end of the show, he never will admit to the grocer, he never will apologize for stealing all of the produce. And what I left with the audience is, how can we have a true conversation? How can that grocer and that customer have a true conversation when the customer will never admit the impact that he's having on that grocer's bottom line, that he actually is stealing, what he is doing, though it's uncomfortable to realize and to negotiate a good person, but I'm a thief as well. That's uncomfortable, it's difficult, but you have to do that if we're going to get anywhere, if that grocer and that customer are going to heal and have a relationship. Likewise, in this kind of work, whites have to come to a place where they understand that this particular behavior, this particular thought, this particular way of being, this thinking that when I come into the room, I'm going to assimilate to your worldview and your communication styles. When I call you on that you have to admit it. You have to accept it. How can we move forward if you continue in denial? And that's really the biggest problem that we have found being a part of Facing Race, Embracing Equity, the difficulty of finding a genuine room where whites and blacks are there and are saying, I'm going to stay in the room, I'm going to accept my sampling as stealing, and I'm going to stay here and we're going to work through this. That's not really happening, except we're doing it in the Race and Educational Work Group.
It's so interesting. If I was a script writer, I know this is a hypothetical example, but if I was the script writer, I'd write a black person into the script and let them sample, and then let's see if it's stealing or sampling. That's just an example of how we can test these theories, because I could almost see the audience sympathizing with Raymond, saying, it's not stealing. He was just trying it out or whatever, right? Let's put a black person in that role, particularly one who's stereotypical. And so these are deep issues, is the point I'm trying to make.
Okay. I want to go off script, if you will, off script, and mention something that you had written in an email back to me. The original script that I'd sent to you, a list of questions, contained a number of inaccuracies. And one of the things you wrote in your email was what white folks didn't seem to understand, and that's the whole history of structural racism, that what a lot of white folks don't understand is the whole history of. Do you remember in your email what you said? And we haven't really talked about that. There are 6 goals that your group has that I'm not sure we're going to get to today. So let's meet again. But let's go back and talk about what you said in that email, what folks don't understand, what we don't understand about structural racism. For a white person such as myself to hear that there is structural racism in the city school district of Rochester might be a difficult pill to swallow. So we need to understand the history. Can you folks speak on that?
Oh, yes.
I'd like to say something
We
about
absolutely
that.
can. Yes.
Just to bring us to a point of clarification, and this hinges on what Judy has just finished talking about, and which I think that Howard's going to go next, is when you have these structures, they've been set up by white people. And so let's look at structure like a white couch, okay? So I've got this white couch, and it's pretty plain. And I decide it really needs to not be so white. So I go out and get some really nice decorative pillows, and I put them on this white couch. And you can say that our school district was a white couch. And then it began to get more and more of these decorative cushions. But it's still a white couch. And those are just decorative cushions. And what we're trying to do is to change the couch so that the couch is brown, black, and white striped of equal capacity. And that is what has to be done in fighting this racism, so that the structure itself is an amalgamation of all of the people that are impacted by that structure, and not a white couch with colorful throw pillows.
Okay.
Very interesting analogy. I'll say to you that in cases in which people have never thought about this issue, have never thought about the public education system as being racist and so forth, often people will want you to say something to them that's going to help them get it. Usually we don't get it unless we study the history of public education. When we talk about the Rochester City School District, we have to talk about it in the context of the broader public education system. Hopefully we would accept you as an ex-educator, I assume continuing educator, that the history of public education in the United States is racist in nature. We know that originally African people, other people of color weren't even allowed to attend public schools. So that in and of itself establishes that it was in fact a racist school system from the beginning. Well, that racism has a history that we can trace, and not something abstract or in my head and so forth, but it's real history and laws and practices, policies, procedures that were laid out and that were implemented and enforced through the years. We can follow those. We know there was a Jim Crow system of public education that's racist in nature. Under that system, some schools got more funding than others, some were inferior in terms of the materials they got. That's racism. So we can't, and we shouldn't, especially educators, argue that the public education system is not racist, and certainly I don't know how we could develop an argument that Rochester City School District is more unique than Buffalo or Syracuse or LA or Miami or wherever, right? It's the same system, same public education system.
Okay, I need to stop right now because
Okay.
this conversation we need to continue, but we have 1 minute left.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is ask that we can continue this conversation later on next time and talk more about specifically what are we seeing today in Rochester that needs to change. We have 6 goals, but right now I'd like to give people an opportunity to at least connect. There are more opportunities available, and I would like you to give us some contact information.
If someone is interested in joining one of the work groups, we have the healthcare, housing, education, criminal justice, and I know I'm missing one.
Jobs and
and employment. Contact Natalie Banks at Action for a Better Community. Her number is 325-5116, extension 1732, and she can give you more information about those groups. If you're interested in being a part of the Race and Education Work Group, just email me at raceanded@gmail.com. That's raceanded@gmail.com, and I'll let you know when our next meeting is.
RACE and ED? Okay, that's actually on the screen, so we'll get to that. All right, we're out of time. I want to thank Reverend Judy Davis, Pat Mannix, Howard Eagle. Thank you very much for being
Thank you for
spotlighted.
inviting us.
Thanks for watching. See you next month.